Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I've got a question for you. What was the score of the Steelers game Sunday? Who knows it? 15-30, okay. How many people out there know it? Shout it out. Or want to forget it? Okay, how many people know what the percentage of asthma is in our city? Phil, are you out there? Case in point, what numbers do we pay attention to? What are the ones that matter to us? And how do we start reframing data and how we work with it in our city and put it around a framework that we can all, I think, relate to as easily as we can relate to who won the Steelers game. I'm going to tee up this whole session around performance. We're going to actually make this one fairly short, but it's pretty important. I think a lot of us, when we think about performance, we think about data, we think about science, we think about statistics. I'd like to put forth 5 ways to think about performance. The first one is this notion of a promise or a commitment we make. And I'm going to use the example here of the convention center. We made a promise. We decided that we wanted to have the world's first green convention center. And we did it. We did it. So I feel like if we can do that, we can do anything. But we made that promise, we fulfilled it, and we did it. So first way to think about performance, making a claim and fulfilling that. Second area is the ability to perform. How do we create systems that actually help us succeed in how we perform? And I'm seeing Jamil sit right there. And we had an in-depth conversation with several great people around this notion of opportunity. And a big part of that was the systems. The systems aren't there. So when we think about performance, we have to think about, have we created the systems that are going to allow people to perform and to really do the things that we want to do, and what are those systems that we need to do that? The third area around performance is, how do people react? We have to really think about what the behavioral aspects of performance are. Will people deny? We know what's going on in some arenas right now. Will they embrace it? Will they turn the other way? What will change behavior and allow people to think about how do they want to perform? The next area is comparative, in that we really need to think about performance as a way of comparing ourselves. And I just have to throw this in: Donald, Hillary. Comparative. Go where you want with that. But how we think about, how we compare ourselves. We wanted to be the world's best, most green convention center in the world. Why not be the world's best city when it comes to creating an inclusive economy? We can do that. We can do that. I know we can do that, but we have to determine how we're going to measure it. So this last point that I want to make before we bring out our speakers is performance from a standpoint of what motivates action. What can we do? What are the measures? What are the ways that people will be motivated? We can throw a bunch of numbers out there, but they may not mean anything to anybody. So what measures will motivate you? What is important to you? Is it what's going on with your child, how they're doing in school? What is going on in our city? Crime rates? What is it that motivates people? We have to come up with the right set of measures in the right ways in which we think about performance in a way that it's going to motivate people to act. And so we can sort of think about those 5 areas: fulfilling a promise, creating the ability to perform, what do we have to do around the behavior component, how do we compare, where do we want to be, and then how do we motivate action? And I'm really challenging us to think about performance with P4 with that type of a framing, and how we really want that aspect of what P4 is about, I think, to help move us forward. And so with that, I'm going to just briefly, I think they will talk about great things and you'll learn more about them. But we have 2 speakers. We have Bruce Katz, which I know many of you are familiar with. He was here last year. And Bruce is just doing amazing work around the globe, around cities, and his focus right now on innovation economy. really means a lot for us. I think we have to think about how that term translates to an innovation economy for all, and what does that mean, who's part of that. And then secondly, Sepp Kambar, who is the MIT Media Lab, and I really love what he's doing because he really is building that human element, and he's really creating patterns around how do we build this into how we make decisions around community development. So we have two great speakers coming up. I am on time, and we are going to move this session along well so we can get to some more fun stuff later this afternoon. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to start by just saying that you are asking the right questions today, starting with Mayor Peduto. You're basically saying, how do we preserve the magic of this special city while we grow? And how do we grow an economy for all? I would also say that you're asking the right questions at the right level. We have a presidential election less than a month away, but after that election is over, I guarantee you that the new leadership in Washington are not going to wake up every day and ask, how do we grow an inclusive economy in Pittsburgh? And your state capital, need I say more? So what we've been focusing on for the last year with a whole group of stakeholders in this city and in this metropolis is what is the innovation piece of inclusive innovation? What are your starting points? What are your special advantages? What's your distinctive play? And I just want to say three things, and then if you really are a glutton for punishment, you will join me later for a workshop, and we can really get into the details. Number one, I think the context for inclusive innovation has dramatically changed. We all know about technological complexity, material and digital, software and hardware. We all know about the move from closed innovation to open networked innovation and how that requires a new kind of collaboration across disciplines, across sectors, between companies and universities. What I want to put forward today is that we are seeing a level of competition in the world today because a whole set of technologies, general purpose technologies, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's genomics, whether it's renewable energy, are moving from the lab to prototyping to mass production to ultimately ubiquitous adoption. And what's going to happen over the next 15 or 25 years as these technologies move into the mainstream of our economies is a certain group of cities are going to basically vault to the front. Think Detroit 100 years ago with the automobile. Think Silicon Valley 50 years ago with semiconductors. There are going to be a group of cities who not only invent the technologies, but they test the technologies, they prototype the technologies, and then they figure out how to make them inclusive, how to get their high schools and their community colleges to teach the right skills, how to grow a broad segment of entrepreneurs within their communities. We don't know which cities those are going to be. But if Pittsburgh is going to have a conversation around inclusive innovation, it has to basically aspire to be one of those cities. And the second piece about this next competition is that the spatial geography of innovation is radically changing. When you move from a closed innovation system to an open one that requires our networks and collaboration, you revalue proximity, density, vibrancy, vitality, authenticity, in a word, cities. And so I think the question that we're trying to answer with a lot of very talented and smart people here is what's Pittsburgh's position? And here's the starting point, because in some respects, Pittsburgh is like the it city right now, right? I mean, all you have to do, and it was talked about by many of the other speakers, is you look at national media, global media, and Pittsburgh is constantly seen as emblematic of a certain kind of resurgence. And we do find that. When you think about just your platform for innovation, you have these incredible anchors, CMU, UPitt, UPMC, that are actually doing advanced research in many of these areas of disruptive technology. You haven't seen the employment effect yet, but there's a reason why Google is here, and Uber is here, and Disney came here. They need to be near the secret sauce. The second thing is your spatial geography, built in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is actually perfect for the 21st century. When we take a look at where companies are growing, they're basically in the downtown, up strip to Lawrenceville, and then they're in Oakland. This is an incredibly concentrated area that we do not see in most cities in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America. You have the right geography for innovation. The third bit is you do have a network. However people feel about each other here, you collaborate a lot better than most places I go to in the United States, right? You may not love each other all the time, but you do collaborate to compete. And you've done that for a very long period of time. There are headwinds to whether you can become one of these target cities, these select cities. We've already talked about a lot of this. This economy is not working for a lot of people here. And you saw the statistics chapter and verse. But there are also other headwinds. You're not really growing companies with large amount of jobs. You're starting companies, but they're not growing here. A lot of the jobs that are growing are coming, and it's a very good thing, from mature companies coming in from the outside, right? So there's a high growth entrepreneurship challenge that is very real here. The second piece is there are certain kinds of demographic challenges. We've talked a lot about the demographic challenges of inequity, and those are very real and very pronounced, and they will basically limit your ability to be one of these cities. But there also has been a loss of people between the ages of 35 to 55 over the course of many decades, which essentially means that there's a whole segment of talent that doesn't exist in this city and metropolis right now to help you basically get to the next stage. So most cities in the country are trying to attract the millennials, right? You've been able to do that for a whole bunch of reasons. What you're going to have to be thinking about is recruiting a certain segment of the population at older ages. What we're trying to do is basically, and I've heard this many times as well, is not produce another report, all right? You're exhausted. Frankly, everyone is exhausted, right? What we are basically trying to do is, with your stakeholders, partners, across a broad array of disciplines and sectors, produce some tangible, concrete ideas and initiatives that you can actually design, deliver, and finance. And that would have a transformative impact within a relatively short period of time. So 3 areas that we're thinking about, and if you are totally masochistic and you want to hear more about this, come to our workout session, workshop. Not a workout, maybe it is intellectually. Number 1, in these disruptive technologies, because they're not siloed, it's not like it was 15 years ago when we're gonna have a life sciences initiative over here. We're gonna have a technology initiative over there. There is a convergence across all these general purpose technologies. So how do you become the place that basically marries, as you're already beginning to do in certain areas, think traffic signaling, frankly, think autonomous vehicles, right? How do you begin to be the place that is able to move across multiple disruptive technologies, right? That is going to require a higher level of translational research and commercialization than is happening today, and is going to require a clear focus on the commercialization of research. And again, without a national government essentially checked in, and with a state that's frankly fairly hostile. Number 2, how do you grow smart density that is inclusive? I mean, think about how you're growing right now. You've got Oakland, you've got the downtown, you've got these other nodes, and in the middle, you've got the Hill District, And around these areas, you've got other impoverished and disadvantaged neighborhoods. You are the city that essentially has to basically densify, has to regenerate these disadvantaged areas of the city, but do it in such a way that you're not pricing everyone out, and you can include a broader segment of the citizenry in the prosperity that is being grown. There are ways to do that, though that's another area for recommendations. The last piece is skills. The next innovation economy is not just for people with doctorates from Carnegie Mellon, great place, or from UPitt for that matter. It's for a whole segment of our population that have the technical skills, the credentials that they might gain in high school. They may actually start being exposed to at early ages, but they definitely can gain and obtain through community colleges and other technical institutes. You have got to be the place that creates a new kind of workforce development in the United States. I don't think anyone owns this right now. And again, there will be recommendations along these lines. So the good news, compared to most places that we do work in, is you have a very strong platform for innovative growth, and you have a very strong platform, we think, for inclusive innovation. But it won't just happen. You're going to have to be intentional, you're going to have to be purposeful, you're going to have to be focused like a laser beam. Because in 10 or 15 years, I think when you hold whichever P4 conference it'll be at that point, the question will be, did Pittsburgh leap forward to become one of those cities, global cities, 25 cities around the world, that is truly not just on the ground floor of technological innovation, but technological innovation that really works for a broad segment of your citizenry. Thank you very much. Come to the workshop.
Can I get my first slide? While I'm doing that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Sep Kamvar, and I'm a professor at MIT at the MIT Media Lab. And today I'll be talking about data, technology, but more importantly, a philosophy behind data and technology in order to shape our cities. And I want to start by talking about a famous calculation made in the 1970s by this radical Catholic priest named Ivan Illich, who decided that he wanted to calculate the true speed of a car. And he said, you know, in order to calculate the true speed of a car, you can't just take the distance that it travels and divide it by the time that it takes to get there. You also have to take into account the time that you work in order to afford the car, and the time that you sit in traffic in order to get to work, and so on and so forth. And he found that once you internalize all these externalities, the true speed of a car is about 5 kilometers an hour. That's about walking speed. And this is crazy, and it's important. And he used this as an illustrative example of a philosophy that he called counterproductivity, where he said, you know, technologies tend to bring efficiencies up until a certain point of application. And then beyond that point of application, they bring inefficiencies in the exact opposite direction of the purpose for which they were intended. And this is true not just for automobiles, it's true for emails and antibiotics. We live in a counterproductive world. And I think about this a lot because I make technologies, and I want to make them do what I want them to do. And the conclusion that I've come to is it's not about technology per se, but it's about the kind of technologies we tend to build. We tend to build a kind of technology that I call self-reinforcing technologies, technologies whose use leads to more use. And the car is a great example of this. A car enables the centralization of work and the creation of highways and suburbs, which then makes the car necessary, which then clogs the highways. And you know you're in an addictive spiral when the remedy is more of the same, more highways, more cars. But I think it's possible to create another kind of technology. I think it's possible to create a technology whose use leads to less use. And we see glimmers of this today in some of our technologies. A great example is an online dating site. If it works, you don't need to use it anymore. And And the key with these kinds of technologies, with self-limiting technologies rather than self-reinforcing technologies, is that they kickstart a human process, a social process, that no longer requires the technology itself. So I was thinking about this a lot a few years ago when I was living in San Francisco. I was going on a walk in my head, and then I look up and I look around and I'm like, it feels like all of a sudden there's food trucks everywhere. And so I started asking around. I said, why? I asked the food trucks. I said, why are there so many food trucks and why now? And it turned out that it was because of Twitter. You see, at the time, it was very difficult to get a food truck license in San Francisco. But with Twitter, illegal food trucks could thrive because they'd park in a different spot every day and tweet out where they were. And it gets better. At a certain point, the legal food trucks caught wind of this, took a look at the followers of the illegal food trucks, and said, hey, this is like a food truck customer database. And so they started following the followers of the illegal food trucks, who followed them back. And this vibrant community formed around food trucks. And that community ended up working to change the regulations in San Francisco around food trucks. And this was fascinating to me. This was software shaping the city. It was the internet shaping physical space. Or to be more precise, it was software kickstarting a human process, a social process, that in turn shaped the city. And so when I came to MIT, I decided that I wanted to do some experiments with this. And so I started with, I'm a computer scientist and an artist, and I did a show at this museum called the Skissernas Museum in southern Sweden. And in this show, I wrote programs that would give instructions to people who visited the museum to make marks on the wall. And this program, it asked the first person to draw a circle, and then it asked each person beyond that to draw a circle tangent to an existing circle. And then once there's no more space, it asks people to color in the negative space. And this is how that piece turned out. And I made a number of these pieces, and in each of these pieces, I followed the same process. I started by creating a basic pattern in physical space. Then I wrote a social process. I wrote down a social process that allowed other people to create similar patterns. And then I created software to enable the social process. And I was interested in this, but I saw this as a metaphor because I was interested in this not just for helping people to draw on the walls, but for helping people to shape the cities around them. So I did a second experiment, and this experiment came because when we moved to Cambridge, my wife told me, you have one job. Your job is to find a preschool for our son, Dario. And so I was like, okay, well, that little I can do. And so when we moved to Cambridge, I looked around and went and looked at a lot of schools. And then I came back and I told my wife, I said, I found our solution. I'm going to start a school. And she told me I was taking that assignment too far. But she let me do it, and the school is called Wildflower Montessori Schools, and there are several principles behind Wildflower, and I'll just talk about a few of them. The first is that it's a shop-front school. It's a single classroom in a shop-front. And this was not my idea. This idea came from the architect Christopher Alexander, who also in the 70s observed that about 30% of the cost of operating a school goes to the physical and administrative the costs of operating a large school. And so he said, well, why don't we just make small schools, 2 teachers, a single classroom, and have the teachers be the administrators? He said, if you do that, you can also put schools around the city so that every child can walk to school. And he showed all these studies that walking to school actually improves the learning that happens at school. And so that's the first principle, it's a shopfront school. The second principle is that it's a Montessori school. And my 2-sentence description of Montessori is that it's a philosophy of childhood that sees children not as blank slates to be filled up with knowledge, but as little people in the process of constructing themselves. And they have the ability to construct themselves And so the teacher's role is to remove the obstacles and prepare the environment for that important process of self-construction. So that's the second principle, is that it's a Montessori school. The third principle is that it's a lab school. And so we started developing technologies that would be in line with Montessori. So for example, we developed these optical recognition technologies that would track the materials that each child is using. And in Montessori, each material corresponds to a very specific thing that a child is learning. And so by tracking materials, you can track what each child is learning. And so you can, for example, see which materials and which concept each child is using over the course of the day, over the week, over the year. And each of those topics fits in a curriculum area, so you can see how much time a child is spending on math or language or sensorial as compared to the rest of the children in the class. And then you can aggregate these, for example, over the year and see a child's interest over time. So for example, you see this child was not very interested in math at the beginning of the year, but towards the end of the year got very interested in math. So that's the third principle, is that it's a lab school. The fourth principle is that I feel like children have so much to learn by seeing adults in their work, especially if the adults are working with their hands. And adults have so much to learn from children being around. And right now, as a society, we tend to separate them out. So the school had an artist in residence, has an artist in residence who has a studio space in the school, who's working on what they work on in a way such that the children have access to them. So that's the third principle. The fourth principle is I realized that I trained for 9 years to become a professor. But my training to become a father consisted of reading like 3 or 4 books. I felt that there was a mismatch between the importance of the job and the training that I had for it. And so the fourth principle is that it's not that Wildflower is not just a place for children to learn, but it's a place for adults to learn how to be parents in a Montessori way. So adults, the parents do come in on a weekly basis and spend time with their children in the school setting. The fifth principle is that if you have a big school, you think about having a cafeteria and a playground. But in a shopfront school, you don't have these things. So instead, we work to shape the city around us to make it friendlier to children and families. So this is a garden that we planted in the park around the corner from the school. And we actually made the parking spot in front of the school into a park. And then we also asked the coffee shop next door to put a low table in the coffee shop. And so the children walked next door and had lunch at the coffee shop. And in the elementary school we started later, they had a little sidewalk cafe. And the sixth principle is that I feel like nature is so important. It's that nature is inseparable from human nature. And so we thought very deeply about how to incorporate nature into an urban school, both, as you saw, on the outside of the school, but also on the inside of the school, so the environment looked like this. And the school has been a wonderful experience for my child, but I felt like if I did it for just the 20 children and families who are in the school, it would not be enough. I felt like there needed to be more of this. And so how do I go? How do we go from one school to thousands of schools? Well, what we've done so far is we've created a pattern in physical space. And so then we can create a social process to allow other people to create similar patterns. And then we started creating software to enable that social process. So we created, for example, interactive maps that show the density of children in the city. And then we made optimization algorithms to see, given the density of children in the city and where the existing schools are, where are the ideal locations for new schools? And then we started to create user-facing software so that we could see what are the available shopfronts in the areas where schools are most needed in the city. And then once people had the space, we created software to say, okay, given your budget, these are materials that would be useful for you to have to start a Montessori school. And then we created a social network to allow children or parents and teachers who are interested in starting these schools to connect with one another to start these schools. And the consequence to all of this is that in the past 2 years, 15 new wildflower schools have started. And that was really surprising to me. I expected this to grow, but I didn't expect it to grow as fast as it did. And I was and I want to just take a step back and just remind us that what we did with the schools is the same thing that we did with the art pieces. We created a pattern in physical space. We created a social process that allowed other people to create that pattern. And then we created software to enable the social process. And the growth of the schools, it reminded me of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who is an acupuncturist. And I was talking to him and I said, Sepp, and I said, how do you do it? How do you heal people? And he said, Sepp, I don't heal people. The body's energies have the ability to heal themselves. But sometimes that energy is blocked, either through cost or lack of technical knowledge or opacity. And my role, he said, sometimes the energy is blocked. And my role as an acupuncturist is to unblock the energy, to let the body's energies heal itself. And I thought that was beautiful, and I think this is true on a societal level as well. I think societies have the ability to heal themselves. People have the ability to heal their own societies, but sometimes that energy is blocked, either through cost or through lack of technical knowledge and so on. But we can unblock these energies by making things easier to do. And I think it's obvious that if you make something easier to do, more people will do it. But what's not as obvious is if you make something just a little bit easier to do, many, many more people will do it. I remember when I was working at Google, we would make a button just a little bit more visible, and millions more people would click on it. And so we can create acupuncture for society by making things easier to do, by making it easier for people to use their natural energies to heal the world. And I think it's obvious that the technologies that we built to support the schools are self-limiting technologies. They kickstart a human process that no longer needs the technology themselves in order to run the schools. But what's less obvious is that so are the schools themselves self-limiting. Take a look at what we've done. We've created a school model which is led by the children and supported by the teacher rather than led by the teacher. In a radically mixed age environment where children of mixed ages and adults work side by side. In public spaces that are prepared for learning rather than separating places of learning from places of the rest of life. With a social network that connects learners and teachers of all kinds and all ages. What we've created is we've created a model that in the success case, it would lessen the need of traditional school because the whole city will become a place for learning. And I think that would be a wonderful result. Thank you.